Hello, and thank you for joining us here for Cherry Blossom Home Edition. The Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival takes place every year, the last weekend of April, here in Marshfield, Missouri. And it's our mission to preserve American history and to present it in a unique and interesting way. This year, due to the pandemic, we have moved our festival online and hope that you will enjoy the interviews and panels that we have in store for you. Our next moderator is a huge cherry blossom fan. In fact, I think she may have coined the term cherry fester. Mary Achor is an outstanding presidential historian, and as a moderator, has moderated some outstanding panels throughout the festival's history. Today, I hope that you'll enjoy hearing her moderate about our first children. She has a great panel, and I know that you're in store for some wonderful stories from American history.
Hello, and thank you for joining us here at the Cherry Blossom Home Edition. The Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival takes place every year the last week of April in Marshfield, Missouri, and its mission is to preserve American history and present it in unique and interesting ways. This year, due to the pandemic, we have moved our festival online and hope you enjoy the interviews and panels we have in store for you. And right now we have descendants of the presidents. Oh my, I love you guys so much. It's so wonderful to see your faces. And it's amazing to me how we can get to be such close friends over this period of time, like 3 or 4 days, once a year, and keep in touch with Facebook and so forth during the year. And friendship just keeps growing and growing and growing. So seeing your wonderful faces just makes me very, very happy. My name is Mary Achor. I'm a presidential historian, particularly families of presidents. I think that hearing family stories brings us closer to our presidents and more than just hearing political and so forth. I want to introduce you to our panelists. We have over here, we have Mary Eisenhower.
Hello.
And anybody guess who she's descended from? It's Ike. And we have Clifton Daniels down here. That's President Harry Truman's grandson.
Hi, Mary.
Yes, that's president of our wonderful Missouri, and we just love him, and we love you, Clifton.
Thank you, Mary.
Cleveland over here. She's granddaughter to President Grover Cleveland. And we have Marie Clinton Bruno, and she has been my housemate at Cherry Blossom Festival several times and saved my buns one time when I wasn't feeling well.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Now I remember.
Marie is cousin to President Bill Clinton. And then down also here we have Jan Williams. Jan is a very, very, very close friend of the Carters and runs Plains, Georgia all by herself.
That's accurate.
Yes.
That is absolutely accurate.
Oh, we
I love you, Clifton.
Really, this is a love fest for Clifton tonight.
has funny stories to tell. And you've got the most amazing mom. And she just accomplished so much in her life. And what I really always liked about her was that she never suffered fools gladly. And so I'm sure you've got wonderful stories about your mom, and we're just dying to hear them.
You talk about my mom?
Yes, I'm talking about your
Or my grandmother. Neither one of them suffered fools gladly.
Well, I know, but we're talking about descendants. We're talking about children of the president. So it's your mom today.
Okay. All right. You want me to start?
I'd love for you to start.
Well, okay. Well, let me start with my mother's favorite joke.
Okay.
My both my mother and my grandfather, and the way, Mary, that you're putting it is polite. They did not suffer fools gladly. They could be rough on people, both my mother and my grandmother. My mother's favorite joke, my boss at Truman College in Chicago, and this is 15, 20 years ago, her name was Marguerite Boyd. And of course you had my mother, Margaret. So you had Marguerite and Margaret trading jokes. And my mother's favorite was one that Marguerite found for a minister was very, very upset. He was angry at the hate in the world. And he was going on Sunday morning about how much hate there was in the world and how people just could not get past it. And he challenged his congregation. He said, can any one of you say that you do not hate another human being? And only one hand went up way in the back of the church, the last row. And the minister came down from the pulpit and he ran down the center aisle and he asked this gentleman to stand up. And the gentleman was very old. He was pushing 100. And the minister said, please, sir, stand up. And the man did, holding on to his cane. And the minister said, is this true? Can you actually say truthfully that you do not hate another human being? And the old man said, yep. And the minister said, well, how have you achieved this? How have you gotten to this point? And the old man smiled. And he said, because every one of the sons of bitches is dead.
That's good.
My mother loved that joke. That's a terrible thing to say about your mother, but that was Mom. She was a good judge of character, and she didn't have much patience for people who would mess around. Both of them, both my grandmother and my mother.
But we know that your mom was a singer. Wonderful story about Mr. Hume saying all kinds of bad things about your mom's voice, and how your grandfather. We might as well tell that story. It's pretty well known, but it's always
All right, yeah. Paul Hume, music critic for the Washington Post in Washington, D.C., critiqued my mother's concert at Constitution Hall in 1950 and said that he was not very complimentary. And my grandfather he was dealing with not only the war in Korea had just started, but on top of that, the morning of the concert, his best friend, one of his best friends and press secretary, Charlie Ross, had died at his desk that morning. So my grandfather was in a very bad mood the next day, and he picked up the paper and he read that review, and he dashed off a letter to Mr. Hume that called Mr. Hume various names, and said that if he ever met him, he was going to need a new nose, stakes for black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below. And he gave that letter to the head usher. He didn't send it to his PR office. He gave it to the head usher. And he said, just stick that, and he put a stamp on it. He said, just stick that in the mailbox. And it got to the post, and the way I heard it, the publisher, Mr. Hume, got that letter, and he took it to the publisher, and he said, hey, I've got this nasty letter from Harry Truman. What am I going to do with it? And the publisher said, just put it in the drawer with all the other nasty letters we get from Harry Truman. And of course, Mr. Hume then went out to lunch with a friend from another newspaper and told him the story. And of course, the friend ran with it, so they had to publish it. The Mail ran 80 to 20% in Grandpa's favor, as I remember. And years later, I've been telling that story for years. And I told it at a retirement community in Evanston, Illinois, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And after I finished, a lady put her hand up and I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "I knew Paul Hume." And I said, "Really?" Because Mr. Hume is from Illinois, from the suburbs of Illinois, I think LaGrange. And I said, "How?" And she said, "Well, I used to accompany him." And I said, I'm a little dense, so I said, "Accompany him where?" And she said, No, not where. I used to play the piano for him. And I said, "Really?" And I said, "He sang?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I have to ask on behalf of my mother, how was he?" And the lady smiled and said, "Like a cow mooing."
Oh no.
And I went home that night and I called my mother and I told her that story. And in the middle of it, the phone went dead. And I thought, Mom, hello. Well, it turned out she was laughing so hard she dropped the phone. So she got a little bit back. She always said, Grandpa, Mr. Hume was in postscript. Mr. Hume was a very accomplished singer, very well-regarded music critic, and he and Grandpa put that behind them years later. Mr. Hume visited the Presidential Library, the Truman Library, got a tour from my grandfather. They were fine afterwards. So it was one review, and unfortunately, it sort of defined a career that was otherwise fantastic. He was a good guy.
Thank you, Clifton. I love that story. Well, let's go to Miss Margaret Cleveland up there. Margaret is a sister of our friend George. Everybody loves George.
Well, I think we need to say George is Margaret's sister. I mean, after all. I can remember.
And also, you guys will have the pleasure of hearing his wry humor. So, Margaret, so tell us about all the children of President Cleveland. And
Well, indeed I will. And I think if you all, know the story about Grover Cleveland, he was 49 years old and a bachelor when he became president, and he married his 21-year-old law partner's daughter that he'd bought her first baby carriage for her, or only baby carriage. And so he had known her all her life. And so it's a great story. She had been at college and he was writing her warmer letters every week. The letters got a little warmer and a little warmer. And anyway, it's a much longer story I want to tell about the children. But what I love about the story is that she came to visit. She was in college and she was invited to come to the White House for the inauguration. But her lady principal at the college said, "Oh no, you can't leave. You have exams." I mean, can you imagine? So shortly thereafter, she went to the White House and she tells the story about walking through the White House with the president. She wrote this in her journal and she said, "The president and I, we took a walk. We took a long walk through the East Room." And then she said, "And we calculated how many laps made a mile. It was 48. So she wrote a lot about how much she absolutely adored him. So then she went off to Europe and he wrote her a letter while she was gone and proposed to her. And she accepted and wrote back to a dear friend of hers and said in this letter to her friend, "Dear Hortense, Rome is beautiful, London is beautiful, Paris is beautiful. I'm going to marry Grover Cleveland, but don't breathe a word of it to anyone." So Hortense receives this letter with a bunch of her friends. Oh, a letter from Frank, because of course Frances was known as Frank, and she was christened and baptized Frank. "London is beautiful, Paris is beautiful, Rome is beautiful. I'm going to marry Grover Cleveland, but whoops." And sure enough, so anyway, so they got back. So then they had to make up these pretend trunks in order to get on the ship so that the press wouldn't follow them. So they made up these fake trunks that said Folsom on them, and they had them, these blank things went on the boat from Liverpool, and they scooted down to Antwerp and got on the boat. It wasn't until they got to New York that the tugboats were all zigzagging up and down the harbor, chasing them, trying to get more information. So they got married on the 2nd of June, in 1884. No, I think that's right. And anyway, then so then they had 5 children, and that all happened pretty quickly between 1891 and 1903. And so Ruth was their oldest, and she was apparently this child who was absolutely gorgeous, and she had apparently a little bit of a temper. And what I've heard about Ruth is that she was able, by the time she was 11, to get over her temper and to manage her temper. And the sad story is that she and her sister Esther both got diphtheria. And Esther was given the serum, the vaccine, in order to get over it. And they had sent the sample to Trenton. They were living in Princeton at the time. They sent the sample of Ruth. You know, they took a swab, and it went to Trenton, and they didn't get there in time. And so by the time they got back to say, yes, indeed, she had it, she died. So she died at 12, which was devastating to the family. But then in 1917, the candy bar Baby Ruth was named after Ruth. And so everybody assumes it was named after a baseball player. But I do always still find it funny when I'm standing in the grocery store and I'm looking at the candy bars as a checkout, and there's Baby Ruth candy bars, and it's like, that's my aunt. You know, I mean, it's the weirdest thing to think that that's named after my aunt. So then the next child was Esther, and she was born in 1893, and she's the only child born in the White House. And she went on to go to England, and she met a Coldstream guard named William Bosanquet, and they got married, and they married at Westminster Abbey. And they had 2 children, one of whom was Philippa Foote, who is worth looking up because she was a philosopher at Oxford, and she came up with the trolley problem. And you all know what the trolley problem is, the big dilemma about if a trolley is going down the tracks and is about to run into a person, what do you do? And you have an opportunity to switch the track so that it's not going to kill that person, but it might kill 3. It might kill 3 if it's in the accident. You could just have it kill 1. What do you do? And there are whole semesters in college that deal with the trolley problem. And apparently the followers of that are called trolleyologists. And so it really is it's a really interesting story. But anyway, one of my favorite stories about my Aunt Esther is that she lived in England, and she got this very British accent over the years. So she was quite British. And so one day she came to Washington, and she went and she knocked on the door of the guard at the White House and said, "Excuse me, may I come in? I was born here. I'm the only child of a president born here." And he's like, "Oh yeah, lady, you and half the rest of the world." I mean, it was like, she must have been a little crazy. And then when she was 77, she picked up and moved to the United States and built a house in Tamworth, New Hampshire, which is where George, my brother, lives and where I hang out a great deal of the time. And so so then there was Marion. Marion was the 3rd daughter, and she was born in 1895. And Marion was absolutely lovely. And Edmund Wilson, in his book, The 20s, writes about Marion, that apparently people would walk into into holes because she was so beautiful. They would be looking at her and crash into things. And she was an advisor for the Girl Scouts very early on. And one of my favorite stories is I gave a talk in Caldwell, New Jersey, which is Grover's birthplace, many years ago. And then I went into New York to see my Aunt Marion. And so my mother was there, and I'm watching reruns of Perry Mason and Mission Impossible, and didn't want to listen to the grown-ups talking necessarily. I was about 16 or 17. And my mother's kicking me, and she said, "Do you know who she's talking about?" And so my Aunt Marion said, "Well, when they'd have a fight, she would come over here and spend the night because, he was just awful to her sometimes." So my mother's kicking me, and I said, "What?" And she said, "Do you know who she's talking about?" And I said, "No." She's talking about, Scott was just awful. You're talking about Zelda Fitzgerald. So sure enough, she was great friends with many of the women and the men of the 20s. So apparently when Scott and Zelda would have a fight, she'd come spend the night with my Aunt Marion. And then came my father, Richard, and I love this part where they always talk about how when Grover was no longer president, it was 1897, and he moved to Princeton, and they always said he moved to Princeton to get a little sun and air. And that was my father, Richard. And so he was born just as they left, and he lived much of his life in Baltimore, and he was a lawyer. And he was actually in the Whittaker Chambers Alger Hiss case when Alger Hiss went on when Whittaker Chambers went on Meet the Press and said Alger Hiss was a communist. and had sued him for libel. My father was his libel lawyer. So that's a really interesting story. My Aunt Esther apparently came over to visit from England, and she knew all about the case, but didn't have a clue that my father had anything to do with it. And then she flew back to Britain, or she probably took a ship at that point, and read in the paper that her own brother was Whittaker Chambers' lawyer, and she was really mad at him for not telling. And one of the things, my mother actually interviewed my father about what it was like to grow up as the child of the president. And one of the things he said in Clifton, this made me think when you were talking about your mother, my father said, well, my father didn't have any of that modern nonsense about togetherness. So I thought, well, that's a therapist's dream right there. So anyway, so that was my father, and he used to tell a story about how when the girls were in the White House, my grandfather would gather them together and bring them to his office, to the Oval Office, and dip their fingers in ink and get them to put fingerprints all over his blotter so that he would be reminded of them all the time and that they would mess things up. So apparently that happened. And then finally was Francis. And Francis was the youngest. He was born in 1903, just after Ruth died. And he became an actor, and he was actually, and he was quite a character. His wife was, they all thought he was a communist. He lived in Tamworth up on the hill, and they all assumed he was a communist, getting all sorts of signals off the top of the hill. But he was in the original Broadway production of Our Town, and he was quite a character and a wonderful, wonderful actor. So those are the five. That's just quickly. I mean, there are lots of good stories, and I could tell a lot of tales out of school, but we don't have enough time. But and I do have pictures if you want to see them. So I can wait and do that at the end if there's time, Mary. Whatever you say.
Well, people.
Hey, Mary, if I may, Margaret, do you know the story? And your brother told me this. Do you know the story of your grandfather's proclivity toward hunting and guns?
Oh yes.
And what your grandmother said when they were in New Jersey, and she said, you know, can we just get through one dinner without you talking about guns? Do you know the story I'm talking about? Are we frozen?
But go ahead, you tell it. You could George told
Okay.
me, so
Well,
go ahead.
no, George told me this. That President Cleveland retired to New Jersey in part because there was, not anymore, but at that point there was very good hunting and fishing, and he loved being outdoors. He loved hunting. He loved fishing. Rather do that than anything else. And your grandmother said, "Can we just get through a meal? We have friends coming tonight. Can we just get through a meal without you bringing up guns and shooting? Can we just?" And President Cleveland said, "Yeah, okay, all right, but if somebody else brings it up, I can talk about it." And your grandmother said, "Oh, all right, that's fair. Somebody else broaches the subject, you know, we'll do it." So as they were getting ready for dinner, President Cleveland went his gun rack and got one of his shotguns and loaded it and took it out to the kitchen to one of the servants and handed it to him and said, "Listen, about halfway through dinner, step out the back door and fire this off." And they had a very nice dinner. They had their guests over, and right in the middle of the meal, there's this terrific blam from the back of the house. And President Cleveland says, "Speaking of guns."
Right. Yes, indeed. Yeah, he was quite a character.
He was.
Hunting and fishing. It was funny because Hillary Clinton came to the Grover Cleveland dinner up in New Hampshire a few years ago, but when she was running for president, and it was right around during the primary. And George dressed up as Grover and sort of introduced the dinner. And so, and the two of them had been chatting, and so Maria, you'll appreciate the story. So anyway, so then Hillary gets up and she thanks all the Democrats, and then she said, "And I just love George Cleveland." And I thought, oh, well, we'll never hear the end of this. And then she said, he told me that his grandfather told him that he used to come up here to New Hampshire and he would fish and hunt up here in New Hampshire, and that's how he would come up with his speeches and his ideas. And I was sitting at a table with a lot of people I didn't know. I said, there are several things wrong with that sentence, not the least of which, of course, was that Grover died in 1908 and my brother was born in 1952. But It was funny. So later I said to George, what did you tell her? What did you tell her? And apparently it had just been a bit of a miscue, but it was very funny because the assumption was that he hung out in New Hampshire and did a lot of hunting and fishing, which he did indeed. So it just sort of, his spirit lived on, hunting and fishing wherever he went. So yeah, it's a good story. But anyway, well, I'll stop and let you all keep going because there's lots to hear about. But thanks, Clifton, for adding that to it. Because yeah.
This is three, Clinton Bruno, and we've got one little girl to talk about with you. As I understand it, was called Scary Bright by Ken Burns.
Ken Burns, yeah.
Documentary, the guy does documentaries. Anyway, he called her Scary Bright, and tell us about her because she's really got a lot of capabilities in her background.
Are you talking to me?
I'm talking about.
There's a lot of buffering going on.
Yeah.
And I can't hear Mary. I didn't know you were talking to me until just now. I heard a little bit about Scary Bright, and I'm not really sure what that is.
Ken Burns said Chelsea was Scary Bright. And
Oh, Scary Bright, like she's smart.
smart.
Okay, I miss a whole lot of your questions. So can you I didn't miss it. I mean, there's a lot of buffering going on. So
You just tell us about Chelsea and also
she's wonderfully bright.
I want to know what she's up to these days too.
Okay. All right. Most of my interaction, I mean, of course, I've known her since she was born. And when Bill and Hillary were still here, as governor and first lady, Chelsea's obviously first child, is in a state house and also at a White House. And I was single at the time, and when I'd moved back to Little Rock, and I spent a lot of time over there because there really wasn't much else to do, and not dating a whole lot. And when they had an assistant during the day to make sure things were taken care of. And then when Bill and Hillary were either out at political functions or work functions, for her, Hillary traveled a lot for the law firm. She traveled to London quite a bit for work. So I'd go over there and hang out and make sure Chelsea got her homework done and got to bed on time and all that kind of stuff. One of those nights, and this was during Bill's campaign in 1992, and this was probably January, and I didn't go there very much after, I got married in 1989, and then Jack, our son, came along. But I did go every once in a while. I would go over there. So this was in 92, and Chelsea needed help with her homework, and I don't know if I called and checked, and can you come over, or they called me or whatever. So I went over, had dinner, and everything's fine. It's kind of frenetic over there, and this is at the governor's mansion. And so, Chelsea, you ready to do your homework? Yeah, let's go upstairs. And she looks at me and she goes, I don't have any poster board. And I went, what do you mean you don't have any poster board? What are you supposed to do? Well, it wasn't a science project, but it was some kind of social studies or something, and there was no way it was going to get done that night. And I said, well, how are we going to handle this? And she said, I guess I need to go. Can we go down to, it was called Skaggs Alpha Beta at the time. And she said, can you go get me some? I couldn't just take her out anyway. You just can't do that with all the security around. And I said, I don't know about that. Let's go talk to your mom. So Hillary was in the study, and she had just gotten off the phone and just busy and and all that. And she said, how's things going? And pretty much Chelsea just said, I forgot my poster board. And Chelsea had this thing cooked up that I could just then sneak out without her and run down the street and get this. And I thought that's not gonna work because this assignment's not getting done. And Hillary put her cup down and looked at her, and she said, you're just gonna have to suffer the consequences. And I'm like, ooh, like that. And I kind of looked at Chelsea, and she said, but Mom, I've got to do this, and Marie will go get it. She said, Marie, are you going to go get this poster board? And I went, no, I don't think so. It's going to be up to you whether I go do this or not. So this is about 9:00 at night. So Chelsea kind of cooked up this idea, that pull out of this, little pickle and everything. So anyway, but she's a very smart, she's a very loving child. I'll show this quick picture. This is this is Thanksgiving 1990, and I'm pregnant with Jack Bruno, who is right there. And this is Chelsea and Socks. And a lot of people think Socks was either born in the White House, and I think it's in, someplace in the archives down here, but he was not. He was given to her, Chelsea was given Socks from her piano teacher that fall. And so it was pretty customary, since my family's not here, they're in Fayetteville, that I would go over, if I didn't go home for Thanksgiving over the years, I would go over to Bill and Hillary's, or my grandparents or my grandmother would have something in Hot Springs. Well, this year we went over after a dinner with my aunt and uncle with my side of the family. Then we went to the governor's mansion, and Chelsea didn't want me coming in. Well, why? And it was because she was scared that I was going to get that feline virus, whatever the virus that cats transmit to pregnant women. And it was agreed upon that I would be able to go over there, and we would just keep Socks away from me. So, but she had this picture, and I don't know who took this, but just said, let's get a quick picture. She'll, Marie will be okay. The baby will be okay. So that was really sweet that she wanted to take care of, make sure that, Jack and I were okay. One of the funniest stories, I think, there's not a lot, I guess I'm the only one on here that knew the first kid, I guess, or that, pretty much it's just a number 42, and you all had presidents before. And of course, Mr. Carter, Jan, I'm sure you knew Amy Carter well, or know her very well. But one of the things being with them all these years, when you get to the White House, you don't do a lot of picture taking, and you really don't hear and you don't share a whole lot of things like this. Of course, the times now where I can, but you try to tell a story in pictures. But the funniest story, I think, is about Chelsea transitioning as a teenager when she's in the White House. She's going into her teen years. And the Secret Service, I'm sure you all have read a lot of stories about the Secret Service, children, I'm sure, with Amy Carter and the Bush daughters and the Obama daughters. And with Chelsea, they go with them to school. They go with them to, if you get to go to a girlfriend's house, they'd rather you come over there because it's more secure, but they dress the part. And so there were guys, if Chelsea wanted to go ride her bike with a couple of friends, they'd map out the place. And these guys, these Secret Service guys, would be dressed as bums on bikes, like they were just riding around the park. And so as Chelsea got a little older, dating was a little tricky. And the night before her uncle, Tony Rodham, got married, he and Nicole Boxer were getting married in the Rose Garden the next day. And I was up there for the wedding and had a very close friend of mine that I worked with at Channel 6 in Tulsa, Patrice Jordan, who was an executive producer at WTTG, which is the Fox affiliate in Washington. And they were having the rehearsal dinner the night before, and, just kind of get lost, just only family, very close family and people that were in the wedding could be there. So Patrice and I decided to go out to dinner. So she picks me up, and you had to run out. You can't just stay on Pennsylvania Avenue. This is when it was still open, and hang out and wait for someone to come out to the car. So ran out there, and we were getting shooed away. And she said, I think we owe Chelsea owes us one. I said, what's going on? Well, that afternoon, when I was over there, before I left the White House, it was time to go clear out and get everything ready for all the rehearsal and all that. Everybody was wondering where Chelsea was. And Hillary, Marie, where's Chelsea? Have you seen her? I went, no. Isn't she still in school? Well, she should be home by now. And I'm like, wait a minute. Okay. This just in your ordinary neighborhood. Where's my kid? This is the first daughter of the United States. And the first lady is asking where the hell her daughter is and all. So anyway, all that said, my friend Patrice said that one of their reporters that was off duty was driving on Rock Creek Parkway and somehow spotted Chelsea walking with this boy hand in hand, I guess, just getting away after school or whatever. And immediately called the station and said, oh my gosh, I've got camera in the car. Let me take a picture. And Patrice told him, no, that is private. Yes, you've got a good story. It's the night before this big wedding. I can't remember, how many family members get married in the Rose Garden, and don't do this. And so anyway, she said the funniest thing that she was followed by Secret Service men. They were keeping their distance back, apparently, but somehow didn't get the opportunity to tell someone at the White House that she wasn't there yet. I don't remember all those details, but she was almost caught by a TV reporter walking a Rock Creek Parkway, and she was supposed to be at this rehearsal dinner. And the family found out about, yeah, we know where she is, and she had a lot of explaining to do and all that. I don't know all that story, but I thought the poor kid couldn't break away just to go take a walk with the guy she liked, you know, and that kind of thing. So, but I was proud, you know, Patrice, you know, protecting her privacy and all. And there was a lot that's tough, you know, when you're a teenager in the White House. So she is bright, smart, scary smart, whatever Ken Burns say. She always has been. She's very compassionate. She did a great job too. She's with the CGI University that Bill does still through his foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative. And they just had their annual meeting by Zoom this past weekend. She and her husband, Mark, and 3 children now, Charlotte and Aiden and little Jasper, are doing just fine. I haven't seen her since June of last year and got my really first big introduction to play with the kids. And they're fun, and they're just crazy, just like any toddlers are, and just a normal family situation. So she finds time to do the CGI things and some other things, and the book writing that she's done with Hillary. And she just hasn't changed. She's a little reserved like her mom. She's very funny like her mom and dad, and she is bright, smart. But again, the compassion is something that's always been there. And I'll close with a story about that compassion. She was probably 5 or 6 years old. I want to say she was in 2nd grade. And this was in the governor's mansion. And there was a big birthday party. It was going to be at an ice skating rink here. And they try to keep things as normal as possible, as they did with the White House, you know, and yes, we'll invite and all that. Yeah, everybody was pretty cool, you know, her teachers and her classmates and all. And so invitations were sent to all the classmates, and I was over there for something and was staying for dinner, and she came home from an after school activity, and it was Bill and Hillary and Tony Rodham, and I can't remember, maybe Carolyn Huber, the mansion administrator, was there. I don't remember who all was there, but I was really struck by something. She was really sad. And so I knew something was going on. So we sat down for dinner, and they were talking about the party, and we're excited. And Chelsea said, "Dad, I've got a question. You know, what's going on?" I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, "I really want," I'll just say Joe, you know, just a kid in her class to come. But she said, "I don't think he can come." And Bill and Harry were like, "Why not?" "Well, he doesn't have a ride, and he can't afford to give me a present. Is it okay if he comes anyway?" So she had no idea that was something that she thought was required for the birthday. And not only did they said yes, Bill and Hillary and Chelsea went in the governor's limo and went and picked the kid up at the house and took him to the party and brought him home. And he didn't need to get a present. So it's just that kind of compassion that they all have, all 3 of them have, and it lives on. I'm really, really proud of that. Very grateful for that.
Very sweet.
Let's move over to Miss Mary Eisenhower, because
Yay, Mary.
Hello.
your dad is one of my favorites, because I almost got a book contract to be part of a Battle of the Bulge thing. And they said I came this close to getting that book contract. And the last thing the publisher said was, if your name was John Eisenhower, we'd give it to you.
I love that. You're very kind to share that story with me, because of course my father and I were 2 peas in a pod. We were extremely close, and a lot of people, you know, just the fact that you've even brought up that he served during the Battle of the Bulge and wrote a huge book on it that made bestsellers, New York Times. And what a lot of people don't realize is that he went to West Point and graduated on D-Day. And at the end of graduation, he was called over to the commandant's quarters, and they told him what his father was doing. And the customary month leave of absence after you graduate, West Point was denied him. He went straight to England to be with my grandfather, and he served as his aide. So a lot of what my grandfather wrote about and saw and all of that, Daddy was right there seeing him and taking pictures. A lot of the Holocaust pictures that you see, for example, were my father's photography. So he had an interesting, shall we say, take on everything. And I remember about 4 years before he passed, which wasn't that long ago, but I said something like, Daddy, lots of books have been written on this subject. I said, and you've written quite a few on, World War II and the Allies and that kind of thing. I said, what about the backstory though? I mean, you knew what color everybody's toothbrush was. And would you consider, like, just, you don't have to write a book, but would you consider putting some stories on tape so that I can give them to my children and grandchildren, and we can have a little piece of history, unknown history, go through? And he said, well, it was classified. I said, yeah, but everybody involved's dead. He said, it's still classified. And he never did it. He could have made millions probably on the information that he had. And he would not, it was classified whether they were dead or living. So I always admired that integrity of his. And Granddad died on March the 28th in '69. And Daddy was appointed by Richard Nixon to be ambassador to Belgium, and hence my 3 years there. So we left in the middle of April after Granddad had died March the 28th. And Daddy had a very difficult time dealing with Granddad's death. You can imagine when they served together during World War II, how close they were. Daddy wrote a very poignant piece in his book, Strictly Personal, on when Granddad passed, and he called it Taps for a Soldier. And so anyway, and his older brother had died at age 3.5, so he grew up as an only child. So it was a very intimate and kind of intense relationship. And right after we got to Belgium in April, Daddy, I saw a similar political cartoon, but Daddy himself saw one by Bill Malden. And he said that it was of some bodies at the cemetery in Normandy, and the caption underneath was, "Pass the word, it's Ike himself." And the one that I saw was very similar, but it was bodies on the beach at Normandy, and they were all covered, but you could see their boots. And the caption was almost the same. It said, "Psst, it's Ike," and I know that at the time it affected me greatly to see it. And Daddy and I never discussed between the two of us, even as close as we were, either cartoon. But he did write about it in his book, and his comment was, on seeing that afternoon, I went to my room and sobbed, which anyway is understandable. And Barbara, my mother, stuck her head in and took a look and closed the door. So, it kind of came under the category of there just aren't words. And I don't think he ever fully, like my grandmother, I don't think he ever really fully stopped mourning him, but he learned to go on. Granddad was a very impactful person to be related to. He was funny, and he was somber, but one thing was for sure, if I had a childhood fear, for example, I was afraid of the elevators at the White House, because people go in those things and they end up on a different floor. I didn't get it. It scared me, and I used to have nightmares about the elevator coming in and attacking me, and I would go down and literally get between my grandparents and say, the elevator's going to get me, the elevator's going to get me. And one time we were on the elevator, I guess, going from the first to the second floor. Second floor was living quarters, and I was just fussing, just one floor. And it finally got on Granddad's nerve, and he turned around and he said, "Mary Jean, these elevators wouldn't dare break down. And the whole way he said it, it was like, okay, General, I get it, you know. But so, you know, Daddy always felt that, yeah, he was tough, but he loved him with all of his heart. And so Granddad just kind of had a way of, if he said it was going to be all right, by golly, it better be all right. It was going to be fine, you know. And I think that spilled a little bit to Daddy, but he ended up raising us a little more leniently, shall we say, than Granddad raised him. And you know, the contrast between my parents, my mother was a disciplinarian, you know, 10:30 p.m. Curfew when I was a senior in high school. If Mom was out of town and Dad was in charge, he'd say, just use your best judgment. You know, and it's like, yay, thank you, Daddy. But I think it was a direct reaction to, shall we say, how he was raised. One of his books, which is Letters to Mamie, that he wrote, you know, it was a published version of my grandparents' correspondence to each other during World War II. But he starts it out saying, I'm certain that I was born standing at attention, or rather issued, you know. So he had a sense of humor about it, but I think Granddad was quite the disciplinarian. Of course, by the time he got to us, he'd mellowed quite a bit, and he was a knee-slapping grandfather. And one time I said, Daddy, how can you say that about Granddad? Because he's so funny and he's so much fun and all that. And he says, yeah, well, he's mellowed. So anyway.
Thank you so much. Did we?
Yes.
What happened to Jan? Is she still here?
Mary, you know that my parents were really good friends with Uncle Milton, right?
Oh, well, that makes sense with Baltimore and all.
Exactly.
Yeah, Milton was a different breed than Granddad. He was the baby of the family.
I love
And we used to call him Uncle Milty. I mean, you know, I feel like.
Yeah. Everybody needs an Uncle Milty, right? But he's kind of a unique character because there were 6 boys in the family when Granddad was growing up, and Milton was the youngest. And there had actually been 7. 1 had died, but they were all boys. And my great-grandmother, by the time Milton was born, really, really, really wanted a girl. So she dressed him in curls and dresses until he was about 5. And the Eisenhower Library will tell you, oh, well, that was the Victorian custom. You know, I'm like, look around. She wasn't Victorian and she didn't do it to any of the others, you know. So anyway, there's this picture of everybody and this darling little girl in the front, and that's my Uncle Milton. And it was kind of funny because one day the boys were reluctantly signed to take him on their weekly, they sold vegetables to supplement the family income. And their mother had something to do and insisted that they watch the baby. And, you know, the testosterone in that family was tremendous. You know, they were all boys. And there's this boy in a lacy dress and curls, and they're like, you know, they did not want to take him. But anyway, Ida won the argument. And so they popped him on top of the vegetable cart, but they discovered something because they got to the farmer's market, and all the ladies would come over and go, what an adorable baby. And they'd start kind of pinching Uncle Milton's cheeks. And then they'd buy vegetables while they were flirting with the baby. So Milton became a regular. Every Saturday he'd go to he was their marketing tool.
Well, and he was sure no slouch. I mean, he was the president of Johns Hopkins, and you know, he was quite a guy. And the other thing I just wanted to add too is my father always told the story that it was that D-Day was his idea, and that he was called in as part of a think tank. And I don't know any more details, but that's kind of quite a thing.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure that he actually came up with D-Day, but I do feel fairly confident that he might have been called to consult to help, because he served as advisors to Roosevelt all the way through Granddad, and I think he retired by then. He was with Hopkins.
Well, Oh,
he
Milton.
retired, and then he got called out of retirement because that was when all the campus
this was-
burnings were happening.
Well, yeah, but my father said that it was my father's idea.
Oh, now that might be. I just didn't think it was Uncle
Also,
Milton's.
apparently, Roosevelt called him one day and asked him if he'd consider running for vice president. I mean, there's just all these little snippet stories, and it's just like, really, it's all I can do to get my laundry done, you know? And you just think about the accomplishments of these people. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it is.
I don't get those kind of calls very often, anyway. But this is a wonderful call today.
Shorter time. Did we lose Jan?
She's not on. She sent a note saying that they were having terrible weather where she is, and so they were having internet problems.
Uh-oh. I hope she's all right.
Unfortunately. Well, I think she just was having internet problems.
Yeah, there's some buffering going on. So, and I'm sorry, I keep looking at the TV, but we just had some stuff blow through, and now stuff is blowing through where I have relatives in Arkansas. So it's just
same thing. Yeah.
that time of year. It's Marchfield. We can either have this or it'll be freezing cold. So it is that time of year to storms and
Abilene's
such.
freezing cold.
Yesterday.
Well, I just love
Well,
you.
come down here.
Yeah.
I just can't believe that we couldn't see each other, be with each other. But it's wonderful to see your dear faces. And all of you folks out there, all you cherry festers, we'd love to thank you for watching Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival in Marshfield, Missouri. It's the best kept secret in Missouri, and it's wonderful. Even men who show up get dragged to the first Cherry Blossom Festival are the first ones hotel reservations for the following year. We hope to see you in Marshfield next year for the 15th annual Cherry Blossom Festival. God bless everyone. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Mary.
everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Marie.
You all.
Take care.
Bye.
Margaret, Mary Jean.
Yeah, see y'all.
In closing, we'd like to thank all of you again for watching, and we'd like to encourage you to stay connected to the Cherry Blossom Festival through our Facebook page and website. Our Facebook page is Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival in Marshfield, Mo, and our website is cherryblossomfest.com. There you'll find more panels and interviews and pictures representing the best of American history. And we hope to see all of you here in Marshfield next year as we celebrate the 15th Cherry Blossom Festival.